Good evening and welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Steve Lewis. I'm the research fellow here with the China Studies program. And I'd like to welcome everybody to come to, I believe it's our sixth session of Politics of Reform in China, drawing upon some of Texas' finest sinologists. I won't go into a lot of detail because it's all in the program, so I could save us all some time. So please refer to the program for the biographies and the accomplishments of our speakers. And instead, let me just say that this is an especially auspicious, important time, salient time to be talking about the politics of reform in China, because as you may know, the 19th Party Congress finished up last week. Every 5 years, the Communist Party meets, selects new leadership. China's preeminent leader, Xi Jinping, is now, as our experts will talk about, well on his way to becoming one of the most powerful leaders since Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping. And at the same time, some other very important things have been happening in U.S.-China relations. President Trump will be there on Wednesday. So this is a very good time to sit down and talk about all aspects about political reform in China and how it's affecting U.S.-China relations, Taiwan-China-U.S. relations, and all of these things. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Wenhong Chen from the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon. So about 5 years ago, I was here as the panel on impact of new media on political reform in China for the 20th anniversary program for Baker Institute. That was my topic that time. Round 2. Big dream, Big Brother, and big data. The weather outside is so nice, so I will try to make this as entertaining as possible. Okay, basically I'm talking about two things. First, what happened in the last 5 years, and the nature, structure, and future of this dynamic between Big Brother, Big Dream, and big data. This was the slide I used to open 5 years ago. That was in spring, April Fool's Day, and in China's Weibo, people were celebrating great news. Finally, we don't need to use VPN to get on Facebook. So what happened in the last 5 years? As you can see, Mark Zuckerberg is still trying very hard, including jogging on Tiananmen Square, asking President Xi to name his firstborn daughter without success. And he was in Beijing last week in a meeting hosted by President Xi. And what did President Xi say? Deal or no deal, friendship prevails. 5 years ago, 2012, there were about 560 million internet users in China. As of 2008, China already becomes the country with the largest number of internet users. Now, what happened after 5 years? Okay. As of July 2017, there are 750 million internet users in China. 96% of them access the internet through mobile phones. China is also the largest e-commerce market, larger than the e-commerce market in the US and in EU combined. And China is also the market with the largest app store spend, and it estimated by 2020, 1/3 of the global market spent in app stores would happen in the Chinese market. We are talking about the big data. China is already the largest market of big data. Again, estimated by 2020, 20% of global big data industry would be in China. Okay. I wonder whether you have paid attention last August to the news that the 5 biggest companies in terms of market evaluation become all tech companies. I imagine it's big news in Houston, right? Because it used to be big oil, big banks, and now, starting from 2017, we'll come to our tech overlords. And if you pay close attention to the top 10 firms, the largest by market evaluation, you see the top 5 are US, or actually global tech companies. Apple, Alphabet, the parent firm of Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. Berkshire Hathaway, I think you know which company this is. And then, how many of you have heard Alibaba? Yeah. And then, followed by Tencent. It's a big company, a big tech company in China and also in the world. I'm going to talk about these 2 companies more in the next few slides. Okay, as Steve just introduced, coming out of the 19th Party Congress, President Xi has become the paramount leader of the Communist Party as well as in China. He is elevated to Mao's status. In terms of interpersonal, you can see the ruling organ of the Communist Party, the Politburo, 15 members out of the 25 members had very close interpersonal relationship with President Xi, either in terms of co-work relationship, schoolmate, friends from the young age, and institutionally, you can see there are no heir apparent appointed. This is a significant departure from informal institutions since the last 15 years. And actually, the first Politburo meeting of the 19th Central Committee of the Communist Party called for focusing on General Secretary Xi as the well-deserved leader of the party, supported by the entire party and loved by the people. So throughout the history of the Communist Party, there were actually only 2 leaders ever reached this status. Chairman Mao Zedong in 1945, and then Deng Xiaoping, the last paramount leader in 1997. And the most importantly, Xi Jinping thought, or more specifically, Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era is enshrined in the party constitution, considered as the guide to action for the entire party and the Chinese people to strive for the great rejuvenization of the Chinese nation. And under the guidance of Xi thought, the Communist Party of China has led the Chinese people of all ethnic groups in a concerted effort to carry out a great struggle, develop a great project, advance a great cause, and realize a great dream. You may ask, what are all these grades about? What struggle they are talking about? I'm sorry, I teach on Monday, and I said, come up for my students, so I have to. Yeah, 4:15 should be the time I finish my undergraduate teaching. And today I have a guest speaker at UT Austin, standing in for me. But I totally forgot to turn that off. Okay, Great timing, right? What is great product, course, and great dream about? 2017, President Xi visited the Chinese Academy of Science, and he made a bold statement during his visit. Those who control data controls power. So in the last 5 years, China has made big data a national top strategy. And if we look at big data, it's both a growing entrepreneurial, innovative space. It's also an important tool for political surveillance and control. And if we examine the big data space in China, we can see there are several different types of actors, with the party state as the very central of this ecosystem. And then there are state-owned telecommunication companies such as China Telecom, China Mobile, China Unicom, and there are indigenous Chinese tech companies. We often see BAT, BAT, Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. And of course, international or transnational corporations also have a very important role to play. And then there are many smaller players. So why China picked big data as a top national strategy? If we boil down the many reasons, there are two. One is for economic development, and the other is political control. So China has picked big data as a potential area to develop national competitive advantage. China considered big data as strategic resource, just as strategic as oil. Remember the slide when we talk about the size of internet and the digital media technology and the sheer number of internet and the mobile users in China. So with this sheer number of users, China has the largest amount of user data. And timing is also extremely important. If you look back history, China has always lamented its lost opportunity for the Industrial Revolution, second wave, third wave, now the fourth wave, and China is determined not to get left behind for Industry 4.0. So the timing is extremely important because the understanding is if you're talking about manufacturing, if you're talking about the IT industry, China has always started much later compared with developed countries like the US and many European nations. But now, as the global economy shifts to big data, machine learning, AI, China hope it can start almost around the same time as other leading nations. And politically, President Xi has talked about a lot national security, data sovereignty, as well as how to use big data to promote government policy to advance fairness and efficiency in development. Okay, so this is the trajectory. So starting from 2014, China set up the first big data exchange in Zhongguancun, widely considered a district in Beijing as the Silicon Valley of China. In 2015, the State Council of China released the outline of operation to stimulate the development of big data. In 2015, President Xi visited Guizhou. I don't know how many of you have ever heard about this place, Guizhou? Guizhou? Yes, right. It's a kind of like, see, New Mexico. Feel free to correct me. Yeah. So it's a, let's see, remote province and have big room for economic development. So President Xi visited Guizhou and visited big data centers over there. And he made the comments. It is reasonable for Guizhou to develop big data. And in the last 2 years, Guizhou actually became the Chinese province with the fastest economic growth. And Guizhou actually has changed from, let's see, almost 0 to hero. And 2015, just a few months after President Xi's visit in Guizhou, China released the 13th five-year plan and makes the claim developing national big data strategy. We are opening and sharing data resources. In 2016, following the 13th five-year plan, there was this first inter-ministerial joint meeting of more than 40 central government department and unit. And they decide to develop several big data pilot zones across the country. And the goal is by 2018, China will have this national government unified open data platform. Again, both for economic development and for better governance. Okay, so now I have a pop quiz. This gentleman here, President Xi, right, visiting the big data center at Guizhou. Okay, anyone recognize this gentleman? The Nova political star almost become the heir apparent at the 19th Party Congress. He was the party secretary of Guizhou at the time. And by now, he already got promoted to Chongqing. And although, he didn't actually become the heir apparent, still, a star, political star in China. People want to watch, right? How about the other gentleman there? In particular for political scientists here, following development in China, I strongly recommend you pay attention to this gentleman, Chen Gang. Yeah, and so Chen Yan was the provincial party chief, and Chen Gang was the party boss of the capital city of Guizhou, Guiyang. And again, because of the big achievement they have achieved through developing big data in Guizhou, Chen Gang has also got promoted. For China Water, you probably know that China decided, again, April 1st Day, 2017, to set up this Xiong'an special zone. And many people were thinking, oh, that's another joke. No, China now pitch it as China's 1,000-year planning to develop Xiong'an as a second capital. So Chen Gang was assigned as the person who will take charge in Xiong'an special zone. And you can see their rapid political rise closely associated the development of big data in Guizhou. Okay, so how about the other players in this space? So these are the national big data pilot zones, demonstration parks, as well as demonstration bases across the country. And the government has been very clear. When you talk about big data, who has the most big data? Tech companies? Telecommunication companies? International corporations? No, the government. They make it very clear. President Xi, Premier Li Keqiang, they commented at different occasions, 80% of the data in China is controlled by the government. Why this is so important? Because if you look at the trajectory of the emergence of the tech industry in China, when we are so impressed by the rapid growth of companies like Tencent, Alibaba, or Baidu, they grow actually outside of the state-controlled economy. In the earlier days, they copy a lot of the products and the strategies of IT companies in the US. They localize those products and deliver it in the Chinese market and develop a huge user base. But many of these Chinese indigenous tech companies, they were founded by private citizens rather than by government officials. So increasingly, the government feel how they can control, how they can have a stake in this growing tech space in China. So one example is Alibaba, right? And I think many of you probably already heard about the Ma Yun, Jack Ma. And so Jack Ma is legendary, right? So Alibaba has a lot of data. starting from shopping, transaction on sales, consumer spend, and payment data, now increasingly logistic data. And they actually was one of the first few Chinese companies develop cloud computing, and then they were pioneer in fintech. They developed Ant Financial, and their app, Alipay, has been widely used in China. And based on all the data they have been collected, they also developed this so-called Sesame credit based on users' shopping behavior, payment behavior. And actually, Sesame credit has become one of the most popular credit score for prospective Chinese mother-in-law, so that they can use it to evaluate the standing of a young gentleman. Okay. So, given all these data, Alibaba has also developed a lot of applications to target customer, to predict a trend, and not just for consumption trend, but also for culture trend. And they provide personalized search results and recommendations. And these applications also help Alibaba to improve logistics and location-based service. Steve just mentioned that Wednesday, President Trump would be in my hometown in Beijing, right? But actually, many Chinese are eagerly waiting, not President Trump, but waiting for this Double 11 festival. This a pure artificial festival designed by Alibaba to persuade the Chinese to shop. Okay, so, and we are talking about the political reform. A few months ago, the Chinese government released the news. It's encouraging private-owned firms like Alibaba or Tencent to invest in big state-owned telecoms. And the first case was China Unicom. And it was announced China Unicom now open its door to investment from Alibaba and Tencent. And it was widely celebrated as, okay, finally, the government is releasing some of the control of big state-owned telecoms. Last week, just after the 19th Party Congress, it's announced that the government is actually also looking for tighter control of indigenous private-owned tech companies. The idea has been floated since a while, actually since the summer 2016, but now it's become real. The national government is seeking for 1% government management stake in BAT. Quote from a Tencent executive: "This is the thing that keeps Pony Ma, the founder of Tencent. This is the thing that keeps Pony up at night. Why? Because these companies, they are already extremely big. Remember, by market valuation, Tencent is the 7th largest in the world. 1% government management stake translated into $4 billion US. But I don't think Pony Ma can get around with that, because again, the government is at the very center of the tech industry, in particular, the big data industry. And of course, another important player in this space is the global player, transnational corporations. So, who is that gentleman there? From Texas, Austin, Michael Dell, right? Michael Dell was giving a talk in Guizhou at the Big Data Expo. And for Dell and other major global tech players, it's become increasingly clear they have to cooperate with the Chinese government. Oftentimes, they have to develop a China strategy, as Dell pointed out, this Dell strategy for China, in China, for China. First of all, they have to have all their servers located in China to handle Chinese data. And second, they often have to find a Chinese partner, and preferably a state-owned company, to work on the big data industry in China. Okay, so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this social credit score. So many of you probably have watched Black Mirror, and now the episode Nosedive become really infamous, right? So basically, in an alternative universe, like everyone's value is determined by their social media scores. And the kind of opportunity, mobility, access to services and product, friendship, love, all determined by one's social media score, right? And of course, Black Mirror is considered as science fiction, but science fiction is becoming reality in China. So across the country, many municipal and provincial governments are developing social credit scores. And the goal is to develop a national social credit score in the next few years. So this one developed by Shanghai in their pursuit of becoming a global city. So they have outsourced this to a local company, Zhengxin Fangsheng. So users can log in with their national ID number, and facial recognition will help to locate personal data from up to 3,000 items of information collected from nearly 100 government entities. Remember, government claim 80% of the data are owned, controlled by the government. And then, based on this data point, the citizen will get a public credit score ranging from very good, good, and bad. And, well, it's good to be good, oh, very good. But if, God forbid, someone got a bad score, that person could not even buy a train ticket. So, summarize. So, if we look at the nature and structure of the big data industry in China, it's state-initiated and experimental. Although there are many different big data zones, labs already set up across the country, but how to develop it is still not very clear. Right now, the strategy is just collect all the data, and let's see what happens in the future. So how this national strategy of developing a big data industry, but also a big data regime, going to affect the political reform and the future of China, again, is not very clear. So is the big brother going to use big data to achieve this big dream of rejuvenation of China? Or the big data will actually change big brother to achieve this big dream for greater social justice in the development in China. So there are still many things open, but one thing is very clear. the party state. Make it very clear, party primacy in every word. So in one last point, we've been talking about the Chinese dream, right? And the Chinese dream is kind of inward-looking, how to develop the economy in China. But increasingly, China gained confidence. And now instead of, or besides of the Chinese dream, there's this notion of Chinese solution, refer to an inclusive world dream and call on people across the world to create a global community of shared future. And of course, right, how different players going to participate is still wide open. So I'm going to leave you here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very informative. Now I know when I go to China and you're not allowed to use cash anymore, you have to use WeChat on your phone. Now I know where all the data is going. So, our next speaker is Dr. Carrie Leo Courier from Texas Christian University.
So my title requires a little bit of explanation. We were chatting about it just beforehand, and I was talking to Steve, and he said, it sounds like a poker game, right? Seven down, 8 up. And so I teach this Chinese politics class, and the first third of the semester, we spend the time talking about formal institutions. So we talk about the importance of learning all the formal institutions, and then we get to the point when I basically say, well, the formal institutions are important, but really you need to know who the people are to understand Chinese politics. So the institutions are just the first part, but understanding the actual players is another important part. And more importantly, you have to understand that even though there's a lot of things that are written on paper, that the reality sometimes is quite different. And so you can take basic rules that you think should be institutionalized, and they aren't necessarily. And so the phrase 7 down, 8 up, it refers to an understanding of the retirement age for leaders. So 67 generally is the age that you can stay on for another round. And 68 is the age that basically you're retiring. It's not a formal rule, but it's a general sense of 7 down, 8 up. And so I think it's a very appropriate way for understanding Chinese politics, because you have to blend together these different kind of components. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about gender issues. So my areas of research generally focus on issues related to gender, entrepreneurship, and arms control, which is a very strange combination of items. But today I was going to focus a little bit more on gender issues. And so when we look at sort of out with the old and in with the new, I thought I'd first contextualize some aspects about understanding gender in politics. It's interesting to look at in the Chinese context for a variety of reasons. One, there's been a lot of focus on understanding gender issues and women's representation across countries all around the world. And so it's an important area of inquiry. But then it also presents interesting challenges in the Chinese context. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about sort of contextualizing it in the academic literature. I promise I won't bore you and be short on that part. And then look at representation issues, and then briefly look at issues impacting advancement. And then I'll talk a little bit about the economy and entrepreneurship, but I can save that more for a question and answer session. So if we look at the position of women versus the power of gender, generally within the feminist literature, there's an understanding when you study women, you look at two things. You want to know where women are located and why. So the position of women is literally looking at where they are physically located within political institutions or within society, and then understanding why they're there gets us a better understanding both of where we are as well as where it is that we're going. And so you put those two things together and it gives you a more holistic picture. So if we look at the position of women and power of gender in a Chinese context, technically the study of women in politics would be a pretty short field of inquiry. If we look at the key female politicians, or women in politics, I should say, probably the most famous would be Jiang Qing, who is Mao's wife. And then there's a large gap between anybody of significant importance. Of course, Jiang Qing's political career ended pretty much with Mao, and then leading, of course, to her arrest and with the Gang of Four. So if we look at women in positions of power, women in politics, you can see that it's not such a great picture. So I put up here a variety of statistics to give you a sense of where we are now. And so 24% of women in the National People's Congress. The National People's Congress is a legislative body which on paper constitutionally should be considered the most important body in China. In reality, of course, there's that gap. So 24% of the National People's Congress, generally in history it's been somewhere between 20% to about 24%. So there's not a lot of fluctuation, and that also tells us something. Usually we see traditionally in communist societies, of course, the representation of women in legislative bodies is relatively stable and almost at a quota system. So it's not as telling in terms of actual positions of power. 0 of 31 women lead provincial governments. That's also very telling at this particular point in time. There are only 2 female governors. There are 0 provincial or municipal party secretaries. This is a very key component to look at. When you look at Chinese formal political institutions, you have sort of the state structures and then you have party structures. And I know we have another speaker that's going to be discussing some of the organizational issues, but essentially the party structures are the most important. So when you look at that there are 0 women in provincial or municipal party secretaries, it's very telling because that's really a launching point to get into the Politburo, which then would be, of course, a launching point to get into the Politburo Standing Committee. And of course, the Politburo Standing Committee is the most important political institution and really the apex of power in the Chinese system. So without having women in the pipeline for that, that puts you significantly far behind. Keep in mind the 67, so 7 down, 8 up. You have to keep those numbers in mind as well in terms of looking at your longevity. If you look at the 89.4 million party members, women are about 26%. Again, you can look over time, it's somewhere between 22 to 26%. So again, very telling in terms of just looking at the basic numbers and representation. You have 24% of the National Party Congress delegates. So we have the National People's Congress, which is the first one up there, and then you have the National Party Congress. They are different bodies, but have the same representation. So again, you're seeing very similar patterns here in terms of percentages. 10 of the 205 full Central Committee members are women. That's actually down from 13, not significantly, of course, but again, a very small number. And you have 1 female Politburo member, and you have 0 women currently or ever having served on the Politburo Standing Committee. And so again, when you look at the apex of power in the Chinese system, you have a simple lack of representation of women in that key body. In the last Politburo, you had 2 women, and so currently there's 1, and so that 1 woman represents 4% then of the Politburo. So relatively grim pictures. I always show this picture when I show my students, and I say, what do you see here in terms of faces? Mostly men, right? It's not so bad. You see the women like, oh, but there are women in the pink jackets. It's so nice that they're wearing the pink jackets to stand out. Those are the tea pourers. So it's very telling when you look at these, when you look at photographs, particularly of Chinese politicians, and you always have, the traditional dark hair. Everybody has dark hair. Nobody gets gray. And then you have the traditional dark suit, and then you see a sea full of male faces. And so there are a lot of things that does, particularly when you study issues like representation. Only seeing male faces generally gives you the sense that only men represent, politicians. But there are a variety of factors we can look at in terms of understanding, what this actually means. So if you were to study women in politics in China, as I mentioned, it would be a very short inquiry. This is it. So you could look at Wu Yi, who was in the Politburo in 2003, right? 2003 to 2009. Wait, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7. So she was for a very short period of time. She was known as the Iron Lady. She was unmarried. I'll come back to this later because it is relevant. She was unmarried. She was known for helping China negotiate the trade deal to get into the World Trade Organization. And she also was in charge of in the area of health when the SARS crisis broke out. And so she served in a very visible and prominent role, and probably the only female politician that many people would recognize other than Jiang Qing from before. Currently, the 1 woman that we have in the Politburo is Sun Chunlan, and she has served in the province of Fujian, and she also recently served in the party administration for Tianjin. She's the first woman ever to have served in the party capacity at the municipal level. And so again, not a long history of women in politics, but there are also some other telling parts that are important. And so as our previous speaker mentioned, one of the things that you have are connections connections as well. She went to Tsinghua University. She has, faint connections to Xi Jinping, and so you do have elements of, knowing the right people or having the right pieces that help you get into politics. That's also very important. So looking at sort of the history of women in politics, this basically would be the end of my talk, and looking at where women are now. But if we don't ask why that's the case, then we miss part of the picture, and it doesn't give us enough of a sense of where we go from here or what the future might hold for women in politics. And so if you look at the various issues that impact women's political advancement, one of the things to keep in mind are retirement age differences. And so to reach the highest levels of the party, you do have to serve an amount of time. You don't find some 30-year-olds up there at the top levels. You put your time in, you serve in the right locations. It takes a while to make your way up the ranks. Then you have to consider, of course, that 67 would be sort of your final age, or 68 would be your final age. And so that's a pretty high cap. But you also have to realize, and this is relevant for understanding the position of women in other aspects of Chinese society, is that there are retirement age differences for men versus women. Women are forced to retire up to 10 years earlier than men. And so it leads to significant challenges. Not only are they retiring 10 years older than men, but official retirement ages are 55 for men, or 55 for women, and then 60 for men, or in some cases 50 for women. When I was doing survey research in China before, there were some women who reported being retired at 45. That would give me one more year before I would reach retirement, which is a little scary. But when you think about the challenges of retirement, not only are women retiring 10 years earlier, but Chinese people are also living longer. This is going to have impacts when we look at the economy a little bit later. So when you figure that you're retiring at 50, right? Think about where you all are in your own individual age range, what that would have meant, and that you're going to live, at least life expectancy now in China is estimated at 75.9, so 76 years of age. And so as you live longer and you retire earlier, you have concerns about your security in terms of being able to provide for yourself. And so this poses a lot of interesting challenges, not just for individuals, but it also places burdens on children as well. And so those are factors to consider in terms of the different retirement age differences. And then again, thinking about how you reach those top levels of politics does take a significant amount of time. If you look at the political culture, no surprise, as with a lot of countries, that you have a really kind of an old boys network. And so to be in the top levels of politics or in the economy and business, there are certain expectations. Generally, women with children or with families are believed to should be spending time with those children and families. Women who don't uphold those roles are seen as abandoning traditional kinds of roles. And that's where the fact that we use unmarried becomes relevant, right? If you want to have a career in politics, it becomes very difficult. And we can make this argument in any country context, our own included, that it becomes difficult to maintain aspects of family because of the societal expectations that you've abandoned that role, which is deemed to be sort of a natural role. Chinese politics can also be difficult because there is a lot of drinking and smoking that occurs as well. And so to make it up to the top ranks, it's a different kind of culture. And so that old boys network is all about preserving that kind of culture. And we've seen it again in the US system before as well, in the business environment or political environment. But in China, that can be very difficult. It can be hard for women to break into that old boys club, which then significantly isolates them from the right networks, the good guanxi, and other ways that they can work their ways up the ranks. And so this has long-standing kinds of consequences as well. There has been some hope that with Xi Jinping's desire to crack down on corruption and cut back on the drinking, that it could possibly help women in politics a little bit, because it moves us away from some of those kinds of elements and brings it back to sort of a more even playing field. So that kind of political culture and old boys network prevents women from elevating themselves in the area of politics. And again, there are things that we have to think of, because those are societal kinds of expectations and norms that dictate what kinds of paths women will take. In addition, as I mentioned, you have the expectations about women's roles as caregivers. And so that's why many of your top politicians don't have families. Another example to look at, if you want to look at greater China, Tsai Ing-wen, who is the president of Taiwan, also doesn't have a family. And so those things are seen as desirable. She can focus all of her time on work, right? But then it also sets sort of the expectation that we're not changing societal structures or norms about things, but actually just reinforcing that you have to fit into certain kinds of molds in order to be successful. And so you don't find, women that have families necessarily that make their way into the highest levels of politics. So there's a lot of elements of gender discrimination, of course, that have to be examined. And I can spend more time talking about those a little bit later in question and answer. The photograph here, I think, is also quite telling. In China, for a while, you used to be able to, advertise for jobs and say, I'm looking for, an administrative assistant who's 5'2", 100 pounds, and, typing skills optional, right? Those are the things that you could ask for. So if you look at the picture over here, the picture is of women who are applying to be hostesses for the Beijing Olympics. And one of the things that they had to do is they had to prove that the gap between their legs was not large enough they couldn't hold a piece of paper between their knees. And so what they're doing is they're standing there with paper between their knees because the expectation is you have to have a certain look, be a certain height, have a certain physical shape, and the skill is being able to hold paper between your legs as an acceptable means for becoming a hostess. And so these kinds of things are, again, problematic because they set expectations about what is acceptable to look for in other aspects of employment, right? Politics is just one avenue of career development. And so when you look at these various components, it's quite telling. So there are a lot of challenges to the position of women in politics, in economics, and society. And again, this helps us think about where the future is heading in terms of the status of women. And so there are a variety of things here I thought I'd mention. One is the OneChild Policy, and another really is the All China Women's Federation. So I'll start with the OneChild Policy, and again, welcome your questions about anything a little bit later. So the OneChild Policy has two ways that you can look at it. I've actually written an article about how the OneChild Policy was very helpful to women and liberating if you take out some of the negative consequences that go with the OneChild Policy. And that is to look at, by having only one child, women were seen as equal workers. They would take maternity leave once. They wouldn't have the same amount of time and burdens spent necessarily on caring for children, particularly when grandma and grandpa now only have one grandchild to help spoil, and so they can fill in some of those caregiving roles. And so in some capacities, the OneChild Policy actually helped liberate women economically by not allowing there to be the same elements of gender discrimination that are traditionally used to keep women from either advancing or being hired in certain positions. So that's the very limited positive side that you can mention. One of the things that's happened, as you know, is that the OneChild Policy has been relaxed. And so families are now allowed to have 2 children. And in having 2 children, there are concerns that women are being asked to return home. And so there have been a variety of campaigns in the past and now in the present that talk about women returning home. And in returning home, it re-emphasizes their role as caregivers and their responsibilities in the household as opposed to being out in the public sphere. And so this is creating a lot of concerns that employers will start to use various components about now women can have 2 maternity leaves, they might have more time off with 2 children to have to take care of, that it can be used as a way to discriminate against women, and therefore it would be problematic. Now, we don't know where this is going yet, but we do know that there have been, again, these calls to return home, partially done by also the All China Women's Federation. So when you look at the organization of women's interests in China, you can look in other societies. We might look at non-governmental organizations and women's groups that could represent women's interests outside of the state. In China, you have the All China Women's Federation as an umbrella organization that wants to be seen as an NGO, but it is a party institution in the sense that you can look at your leadership, you can look at the direction coming from the top down, and so it's not really an independent NGO. In their efforts to be declared an NGO, actually the international community raised a lot of concerns because you don't have a sense of actual autonomy from the state, and the state truly being the party. And so in that sense, it doesn't have the kinds of freedoms that you would expect to truly protect women's interests. And in fact, the All China Women's Federation has been known for not being very supportive, in fact, of various components when it comes to women. They have talked about women being in an inferior status and have promoted ideas that you would not expect to come from an organization that on paper is designed to promote and protect the interests of women. And so that rhetoric on various women's roles has been a real challenge, and it's another one of the continued obstacles, particularly when you don't have a lot of ability for outside interests to organize on women. This gets me to this last point, which will help understand why gender issues are important in understanding Chinese politics today, sort of in general. So some of you may be familiar with the Feminist Five. In 2015, there was a group of 5 women who were disrupting society by trying to raise awareness and pass out stickers on International Women's Day to raise awareness about sexual harassment on public transportation. For their actions, they found themselves detained, and it was very controversial because they were believed to possibly get very long sentences as a result of these suspicious activities that were disrupting society. Note the sarcasm in there. And so when you think about, what is the big deal, right? What's the big deal about raising awareness about sexual harassment on public transportation? Why does this end up being something that has to be cracked down on? And part of it is because we have to understand the lack of civil society in the Chinese context. And so there are a variety of ways when you look at how society is organized that you don't have the free ability to organize around any interests that you may see fit. And as a result, anybody who does organize around interests that could be potentially destabilizing have to be reeled back in, right? We see this with the environment, we see this with labor protests, right? These are larger issues that are underlying some of these protests. Sexual harassment may not seem like a big state-changing kind of problem, but protests and actions that raise awareness about the state's inability to deliver for people is a real problem. And that's where the challenge is raised. So how is gender a threat to the state? If we look at the various components, as I mentioned, sexual harassment and domestic violence are 2 women's issues that have recently gotten a lot more attention. Now, they've gotten a lot more attention in our country context as well. And so this is not just unique to China, but we don't see them as the kind of socially destabilizing elements. This raises awareness that the fact that there is inequality not just in the public sphere, but also in the home. Domestic violence raises issues about challenges in relationships inside of the home, which again gives us a sense of how the state has not been able to address needs in both public and private sphere life anymore. And so as a result, these pose potential challenges as the state is reminded of ways it's unable to deliver. In addition, you have a lot of economic concerns. And so in some of my other research, I've done a lot on looking at how women have been impacted by economic reform and how their employment opportunities have changed over time. The flower vases are a phenomenon that we're seeing more and more of. And what the flower vase phenomenon is that women are being hired to look pretty, like a flower vase. Right? They're not being valued for the skills that they may bring. And again, this is sort of this falling back to a sense of what appropriate roles are or discriminated against women, especially when times get economically tight. It doesn't take much to look at the Chinese economy and realize they cannot provide all of the jobs that are necessary to keep that economy afloat, right? To keep all of those students from getting upset, to keep young people feeling happy enough. And this is where, again, we get into these concerns about civil society. If you can't keep people happy, then that's going to lead to significant problems in the future. And so women have seen their employment opportunities change quite tremendously. The service sector has expanded, which is not the most profitable sector. As our last speaker mentioned, it's the tech industries, it's more of the tech entrepreneurship that we're seeing a lot more emphasis on. You can look at the tech industries in every country context and realize that it tends to be very male-dominated. And so again, you have concerns about women losing ground economically. So there's an erosion, actually, of entrepreneurship for women, not an erosion of entrepreneurship in China, but specifically for women. In economic reform, actually, women did relatively well when you had this changing efforts to create a private sector alongside the state sector. They were the last ones hired, they were the first ones fired, they were pushed into what was the untested private sphere, private being the market-based sector. At the time, nobody knew what that would be. And as we look back, it turned out to be pretty good, right? And so as time has gone on, that movement has shifted. And so you actually do find different generations of women who did relatively well, not by intentional state policies, but by unintentional state policies that were really about discrimination. And so that shift has started to occur now in a different direction, where you're finding men who have done relatively well and a return to sort of the ideas that we must bring women back into the home and provide more, preserve more of the rice-winning jobs for men. And lastly, of course, you have concerns about urban and rural inequalities. The All China Women's Federation and the state have mentioned that there is a low quality of women. The low quality of women is about rural women not meeting sort of the economic standards that you would expect in urban areas, but specifically identifying women in rural areas as low quality doesn't help their economic or political potential. So what I wanted to end with is really this concern when it comes to politics and also economics. The study of gender is quite telling because we can look at where women are and we can look at why they're there and then question, where it is that they're going. And so when we put all of those things together, we can see where they've been, we can see where they are, which is not great, and we can see there's not a lot of upward trajectory in terms of where they're going. The economic issues, and this is probably one of the most important points I always present to my students, is when you understand Chinese politics, you have to look at how the state is able to maintain power when there isn't really the strong belief in communism anymore, right? Communism isn't the driving sense behind the party and the state today. What it is economic development. And so the only way that the state and the party maintain power is to basically deliver economically. And those are the biggest challenges that are presenting the Chinese system today, and women are just one piece of that. And so I'll end there.
Very, very informative. So our next speaker will be Dr. Hans Stockton from University of St. Thomas.
You jumped the gun there. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Dr. Lewis, thank you, as always, for the invitation. So you'll have to excuse me. I'm about 13 hours time jet lagged and came home to two very angry daughters for being gone all last week. So as I looked through my presentation, there's a big link right in the middle of it right there. But anyway, as I looked through my presentation after I emailed it to Steve this afternoon, I realized that it's kind of a gloomy presentation. And I really didn't mean to set out to be a big rain cloud. But I do think that what we'll talk about here over the next couple of minutes is an important call to action with regard to a very important issue that affects both China, the United States, vis-a-vis Taiwan. So, Xi Jinping's new era in China's strategic vision. What I'll do is I'll start at 40,000 feet, talk a little bit about what we've learned about President Xi's strategic vision, and then kind of work our way down the narrative to how that relates to Taiwan, and then how that relates to the United States and our role in East Asia. So, let's see. Nothing is happening, Steve. I'm now also incapable of working a PowerPoint. Let's see, multiple times.
There's a keyboard.
I'm going to go with the keyboard. There we go. How about that? Nope. I think I'm locked up here, Steve. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, very good, very good. Something happened. Very good. So very quickly, quick overview on the People's Republic of China power and power projection. Everybody knows that China is becoming a global strategic power, and of course President Xi has so much as told us that's certainly in the cards in the near future. China is ranked in quantitative and qualitative indexes as a third most effective or largest military in the world, right after the United States and Russia, and with in particular advances in air and sea capabilities over the last 5 years. Within Xi's presentation, he identified the year 2020 as the year of realizing mechanization, significant progress in information technology, and to then take a big leap in strategic ability. Now just think, 2020 is only a couple of years from now, and he thinks that China still has to make incredible progress in information technology. Given what we heard with our first speaker, goodness knows what he means when he says take a big leap from the present day. 2035 is to achieve a modernized national defense, and then 15 years later to achieve what he calls a world-class military. Now, with regard to regional power projection, we've seen quite a bit of that with China's base buildings in the South and East China Sea and development of what's known as A2AD, or anti-access area denial capability in that part of the world. A lot of reports now indicate that China is moving beyond A2AD to not just denying access, but denying access and holding territories. But not to be alarmed, President Xi, in his speech, told us that China does not pose a threat to any other country, nor does it seek hegemony. However, and this is language that we haven't normally heard in the past, no one should expect China to swallow anything that undermines its interests. So, lest we forget what the industrial military capabilities of China are these days, this is Fiery Cross Reef in 2009 in the Spratly Islands. This is the same island in 2015 with some tender mercies. This is Subi Reef in 2012, also in the Spratly Island chain, and this is Subi Reef now in 2016. We are fooling ourselves if we think the United States or any other actor in the region is going to force China to roll back its claims in the South China Sea. It is simply not going to happen, barring something incredible. So, Xi Jinping's new era. After decades of tireless struggle, China stands tall and firm in the East as a regional power, but also has become a mighty force that can take on global leadership. A new era will be one that sees China moving closer to center stage and making greater contributions to mankind. And of course, this marks the official death of whatever was left of Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy, in which China would bide its time, wouldn't show its strengths, and never take center stage. That is officially dead. And of course, for Xi Jinping, national rejuvenation is a term we see repeatedly in his comments, and this is at the heart of the Chinese dream. So, China's rejuvenation requires national reunification. And here's a rather extended aspect, but if all the sons and daughters of China, including those of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, follow the great tide of history, equally undertaking the virtuous cause, etc., gripping the nation's destiny within our hands, then together we can most certainly create a rejuvenation of the Chinese race and build a wonderful future. My heart is warming as I speak. Now, the thing is, though, national reunification, which is requisite for rejuvenation, requires Taiwan and the return of Taiwan to the motherland. And Xi Jinping tells us, it wasn't just here but elsewhere, of his 6 innies policy with regard to Taiwan. We will never, and count as we go, just to make sure we got the numbers right, we will never allow anyone, any organization, or any political party at any time or in any form to separate any part of Chinese territory from China. Now, I think he might be equivocating a little bit here. We have the resolve, confidence, and the ability to defeat separatist attempts for Taiwan independence in any form. Now, added on top of that, over the last several months, give or take the last year, leading up to the Congress, President Xi has made remarks on several occasions that the Chinese leadership can no longer continue to kick this particular can down the road, and that it must be resolved within this generation. Now, hopefully he's talking about the generation that's coming up behind him that might buy us about a decade. But if he's talking about his generation, then there's going to have to be some quick action on these things. So what's Beijing's key to moving forward here? And this comes out of President Xi's comments. Only by recognizing the historical fact of the 1992 consensus that both sides belong to China can the two sides conduct dialogue to address the concerns of the people of both sides. And no political party or group in Taiwan will have any difficulty conducting exchanges with the mainland. It's just that simple. Now, who is not mentioned within this simple solution, and that is the United States in any form, in any way? Well, the triangular relationship now becomes an issue for the United States. Taiwan coming out of rejuvenation, reunification, and this becomes a concern for us. So barring President Trump's actions re-North Korea, Taiwan represents and still does the primary flashpoint of major conflict between China and the U.S. We are not going to go to war against China over trade issues, over human trafficking or IT, intellectual property rights, et cetera. The one thing that might spark something large scale would be the issue of Taiwan. And so the PRC position is very clear. One China includes Taiwan as a province. Next question. The U.S. position becomes a little more complicated. Our position on Taiwan is informed and in fact governed under our One China policy that consists of the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a domestic law, and the 6 assurances expressed by then President Reagan. So the goal here is to conduct unofficial, not state-to-state, but people-to-people relations, promote a peaceful resolution of the situation, not take a position on sovereignty, provide Taiwan arms of a defensive nature, which is a little dodgy these days, and pursue or accept only non-peaceful, and that to view non-peaceful solutions to this issue as of grave concern to the United States. And of course, that's diplomatic language. You don't hear that very much anymore, but it used to mean, please take us seriously, we mean it. So, why has Taiwan now become an issue of concern for the United States, and in particular, President Trump? And that is in 2016, the Taiwan voters elected Tsai Ing-wen as their president in a large margin, as well as elected an overwhelming majority of her political parties into the legislative yuan. That ended 8 years of a love fest rapprochement. That's all the French I have. But between then the ruling party, Kuomintang, and then President Ma Ying-jeou. During that 8-year period, tourism blossomed in Taiwan. Taiwan was experiencing a little more international space. They weren't losing diplomatic allies to Beijing like they had previously, except for one instance towards the end of Ma's presidency. And this was the condition for that rapprochement. Ma and the Kuomintang accepted that 1992 consensus. There is one China with 2 interpretations. Now, the Chinese never agreed that they would actually ever give any weight to the interpretation coming out of Taipei, but they acknowledged the fact that there might be some different ideas that would have to be hammered out and resolved later. So President Tsai, during her campaign and to this day, has refused to acknowledge that a binding consensus, a 1992 consensus, exists and refuses to agree to party talks under this condition. For Beijing, they say, all you have to do, let me hear the words come out of your mouth, 1992 consensus, and we can talk about all things under heaven almost. And of course, that would be political suicide for her in some regards. So, an irresistible force, China, meets an immovable object, Taiwanese public opinion. And what you see here is, if I haven't well, now I just turned it off, Steve. There we go, okay. Wow, that's what, I thought it was a lightsaber, so I'm not going to chop a finger off. There we go. So here's surveys that go all the way back to 1992 up until, I think these are June, July of 2017. People on Taiwan are asked whether or not they prefer to maintain the current status quo of Taiwan's fuzzy international existence, whether that would be decided at a later date, this whole are we independent or should we return, be reunified under Beijing. They're asked, and this is 33%, 25% feel that we should just maintain the status quo forever, because any declaration of independence is going to prompt or provoke an attack from China, and we don't want that. So this is kind of a Goldilocks, just right spot for us. Only about 18% of people surveyed by the Election Studies Center tell us that, maintain the status quo now. We don't want to cause trouble, but we want to move towards independence at some later date. And then these are the rest. That red line, that 2%, that's the respondents that hope for reunification with Beijing sooner than later. So you see that dog ain't got legs. Then that second aspect to understanding this immovable force, or immovable object, is how people view themselves. When you hear language about Taiwan from Beijing, it's, the good old language used to be Chinese compatriots on either side of the strait, et cetera, et cetera. We're all part of the Chinese family. Well, you know what? 56% of the people in Taiwan, as high as 60% just 3 years ago, when they're asked, do you see yourself as Taiwanese, as Chinese, or as both, Chinese and Taiwanese, more than half the population simply see themselves as being Taiwanese. The percentage of the population that see themselves as being Chinese only is less than 5%. This group here, 36%, are the respondents that say, well, civilizationally, you know, Chinese, our families come from Chinese if you go back far enough, but Taiwan is our home now and we've developed ourselves a nice little society. So, Beijing is putting the squeeze on Taiwan. And it's more like, what do you cook a lobster? I should stay away from food analogies. You boil it slowly. Frog. I should stay away from food analogies. Thank you, John. So anyway, Beijing is putting the squeeze on Taiwan since the 2016 election of President Ma. Obviously, they've terminated high-level contacts with Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council, the official ministry to manage communications. I met with senior officials in the Mainland Affairs Council just last week, and nope, there's no high-level kind of direct communications. However, there are ongoing operational communications when individuals might be in a certain difficulty or aid needs to be provided, but nothing high-level. China's been reducing the number of Chinese tourists allowed to visit Taiwan. I was going to write Chinese tourists that travel to Taiwan, but you still need permission in some instances. The hotels in Taiwan 2 years ago were full of Beijing Hua, Guiying, the Beijing accent. There were entire separate eating areas that were set up to accommodate the Chinese tourists in Taipei's hotels. You couldn't walk into a business hotel half the time and just get a room on the spur. Nowadays, it's a lot quieter. Taxi drivers complain to me. The tour companies are fairly unhappy. The hotels are losing business. China's hurting Taiwan's economy, but in a really creative way. By hurting the service industry, they're hurting the grassroots of the economy. The bellhops, the cleaning ladies in the hotels, the shuttle bus drivers. These are the kinds of folks that they're trying to put the squeeze on. Beijing continues to court ROC, Republic of China's remaining diplomatic partners. Sao Tome and Panama were lost just recently. And barring Taiwan from participation in international organizations as observers, such as the World Health Assembly and the ICAO, Aeronautics Aviation Organization. Taiwan was allowed to participate during that period of time of Ma Ying-jeou's presidency when they had accepted the 92 consensus. That's off the table now. And of course, some fairly aggressive and interesting military maneuvers. So, the U.S. comes in. It seems like the pressure's building. We are Taiwan's only security guarantor, despite the unofficial nature of our relationship. If things go south, guess who gets a phone call? Now, looking at the Trump administration position on Taiwan is really kind of difficult. First off, President-elect Trump in December of 2016 takes the phone call from Taiwan's president, the first time that there's been such a public direct conversation between the American president-elect and the leader on Taiwan. This was followed shortly thereafter by Trump, casting doubt as to the American commitment to our longstanding One China policy, saying all things are negotiable, and can I use all hell is breaking? Is that like all hell is breaking loose? It seems. Okay. Well, then President Trump agrees with President Xi's request prior to their first phone conversation that President Trump re-acknowledge the longstanding U.S. One China policy in order for Mr. Xi to not be in the shower shampooing his hair when Mr. Trump calls. I paraphrase. And of course, President Trump reaffirms the longstanding American position on the One China situation. And of course, just not that much longer, later in June, President Trump gleefully informs Congress of it's actually $1.28 billion arms sale that's he notifies Congress about. And by the way, almost all of which goes to Raytheon, a single corporation and its subsidiaries. Now, in the midst of this kind of pendular chaos, you have the American Congress, which is taking up the slack at every possible turn. Of greatest significance, you guys probably knew about this already, is that not just the House, because the House can do all sorts of crazy stuff because they think the Senate, as the kind of deliberative body, will crush crazy ideas. So the House is like, hey, let's try this. Let's try this. So the House put into amendments of the National Defense Authorization Act for this year 3 Taiwan-related amendments. One was to normalize arms sales to Taiwan, kind of making it go through a standard process that we go through with everybody. The second was to allow for U.S. Navy ships to make ports of call in Taiwan, in places like Kaohsiung in the south and Keelung in the north. And then the third was to normalize the political relationship between us. 2 of those amendments actually made it out of the Senate. One was to normalize arms sales, and the other was to allow for U.S. Navy ships to make ports of call in Taiwan, which hasn't happened since, 1973-ish, give or take. There is the Taiwan Security Act, which is still making its way through the Senate. Taiwan Travel Act, which is making its way through the Senate, which would allow higher-level U.S. officials to travel to Taiwan and communicate directly with their counterparts in a government that the United States does not still recognize. So you have the unpredictability of Donald Trump with the kind of overzealous eagerness of the American Congress to improve the relationship. Am I doing on time there, Steve? Okay. So, and I don't want to be unfair, but I got to tell you, Xi Jinping rocks. I mean, it might have taken 4 hours, but that guy, there's not a lot of room for, what did he mean when he said? So if we look at the leadership on the Taiwan issue from the American side and from the Chinese side, Xi Jinping, coming out of his recent speech, right, has clarity on Chinese security interests in East Asia. South China Sea, it's ours. East China Sea, it's ours. Taiwan belongs to us. No questions. President Trump has a poorly elaborated U.S. regional vision, and one in which we're not quite sure what the guiding values are. Tillerson himself, several months ago, said the United States maybe is not going to be guided in its foreign policy by values. Things like democracy, human rights, meh. Xi Jinping made clear statements on one China and the Taiwan position. President Trump has clearly, and I'm not even talking about his tweets, all right? I'm just looking at his TV interviews, right? And things that his White House staff has done a pretty good job clarifying. But President Trump has demonstrated an inability to master the nuances that are especially essential for messaging with regard to the U.S.-Taiwan kind of relationship. President Bush, back in 2000, during his first month in office, in an interview with ABC News, was asked by the reporter, what would the United States do to protect Taiwan? And his response at the time was, whatever it takes. Oh my goodness. The busyness that created and the re-explaining what that created. But I'm not quite sure if President Trump could really explain to you this one China policy business. President Xi has provided consistent messaging and framing of Chinese interests as non-negotiable. President Trump is characterized as a transactional decision maker, right? And this leads some to think that he might use Taiwan as a bargaining chip. This is something that we hear all the time in Taiwan. But if the Chinese think that he would use Taiwan as a bargaining chip, then they might pursue certain policy requests or ideas or suggestions that would end up in a gross misprediction of the American intent. China has become the economic pull for America's strategic partners. Many of us don't realize this, that even our closest strategic partners in East Asia, their leading trade partner is no longer us, it's China. And of course, President Trump's rhetoric about defense burden sharing and trade sanctions only in that context, I think, weaken the American position in the region generally. If you read President Trump's comments or discussion with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, you'll see a lot of this kind of come through the kinds of things that he is saying to Japan's Prime Minister. So, oh my goodness, what's to come? Well, there's a list of things. I don't see this getting any better. It's very clear. China will not back down on the Taiwan issue. And the United States, at least if you look at what Congress is doing and the kind of rhetoric that come out of our defense industry, the United States is not about to back down on our guarantorship over Taiwan and our commitment to Taiwan for a lot of other very important reasons, trade being, of course, one of them. But what's going to happen is Beijing will be increasing the pressure on Tsai Ing-wen. In January, coming up in a couple months, they have local elections in Taiwan. If the KMT improves its stake in those elections, I think that China might back off a little bit to give the KMT space. If the DPP does better in those local elections, I could see at least one diplomatic ally being swiped within the next 3 months. Increasing declines of tourism allowed into Taiwan, which will hurt the economy. And these things only then ratchet up the need for the United States to be ever more vigilant and diplomatically ready to manage the nuances of that discussion with Xi Jinping and some very well-educated people. Last point, Taiwan Affairs Bureau, which manages officially manages the relationship in the mainland, recently replaced most of its senior leadership, and most of those guys are actually very well-trained American specialists, not so much Taiwan specialists. So Beijing is going to look at its Taiwan policy more and more through the eyes of how to kind of get in there and separate that American commitment through folks that understand us best. Hey, wasn't that fun? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Also very informative. Not as dark, I think, as you were leading us to think. Our final presentation, also from University of St. Thomas, Professor John Taylor.
Thank you, Steve. I don't know how I follow this. Mine's going to be the darkest talk of all. My apologies in advance. Good afternoon. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate being here. And thanks to Baker Institute China Studies Program as well as Rice University. Just to give you a background, between October 18th and the 24th, the CPC held its 19th Party Congress. As has been established by party rules, the Congress basically has two functions: for the General Secretary to deliver a political report and also to finalize personnel changes. There's also an additional thing that occurs, and that is the Congress also makes substantive policy guidelines basically for the party state. Does it work? It does work. So what exactly happened at the 19th Party Congress? Simply put, in a nutshell, it was all about Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping solidified his grip on power in at least three fundamental ways: by being named in the party constitution, by promoting a sizable number of his allies to senior leadership positions in the Politburo and in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and by retaining control over the anointment of a successor. Xi articulated and appears to be in a position to implement his vision of strengthening China by revitalizing the party in ways that his predecessors did not manage to accomplish. Xi underscored the notion of a resilient and globally attractive Chinese economy, and in a model specifically that involves clear party control over the economy with limited role for the market in addressing certain resource efficiencies and a major enduring role for the state sector. Xi also made it clear that his policy priorities are the party's priorities, period, and that the CPC will now tolerate slower growth over the long term in order to tackle the issues of pollution, deleveraging, housing, poverty, access to health care, education, and income equality. These were all signaled in advance months ago at various speeches that she gave, particularly at the 90th anniversary of the PLA, the anniversary of the founding of the party in July. It was fascinating how this was all telegraphed in advance. She also expressed that China will continue to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy, presenting itself as a role model, an alternative to the West, and a shaper of the global order. She and other senior leaders also stressed that China welcomes foreign investment and will not discriminate against foreign firms. Let's hold them to that. I'd like to briefly discuss three of the takeaways that I see from the 19th Party Congress. The impact of Xi Jinping thought on the party moving forward, the continuing push for anti-corruption supervision and its enforcement, and finally, the role that personnel changes within the Politburo may play in China's move to a more muscular, and that's the term I would definitely use, muscular foreign policy. So takeaway number one, Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought. Xi Jinping is now essentially the leader of the Communist Party of China for as long as he wants to be. This has implications on a host of areas in Chinese life, as the party will likely seek to gain more control of the Chinese economy and society for the foreseeable future. The Party Congress approved the addition of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. By the way, you can buy this at souvenir shops. Taxi cab drivers all over Beijing are carrying these now. They basically put Xi Jinping thought into the CPC Constitution. It's now on a par with Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the theory of the three represents, and the scientific outlook on development, all of which, by the way, have been in the Constitution. What's interesting, though, is, unlike his predecessors, it represents a unique status for Xi, because his name was specifically stated in the title, much as Mao and Deng. More importantly, the amendment to the Constitution took place when Xi was still in office. The only other person who had that happen was Mao Zedong. While Xi is commonly referred to as China's president, which is technically true, the most important title is, of course, General Secretary of the Communist Party. He holds over a dozen chairmanships of high-level committees, for which Australian sinologist Jeremy Barmay once dubbed him the chairman of everything back in 2014. And he's not off, by the way. Barmay's not off. At the Party Congress, in fact, Xi solidified his authority as the chairman of everything by achieving an entirely new level of prominence, by having his ideology enshrined in the party's constitution. What this means is important. It means that as long as Xi Jinping is alive, he will likely be the ultimate authority on Communist Party ideology in China, in office or out of office, much like Deng Xiaoping. While Xi shows no successor in waiting at the Congress, he also didn't break the informal retirement precedent, as Kerry mentioned, about 7 up, 8 down, by basically not keeping Wang Qishan, who was on the standing committee and leader of the Central Commission on Discipline Inspection. But the lack of an informal successor in waiting creates tremendous lack of clarity about what will actually happen in 2022 when Xi's second term as General Secretary expires. The ultimate question is going to be, will Xi find a way to remain as General Secretary after 2022? And don't feel bad for Wang Qishan. He's good. He's not gone from Chinese political life. In fact, he recently authored a chapter in a book that was a state-published book by Xinhua Publishing that was on Xi's speeches, surprise, whose central thesis was, quote, upholding the Communist Party's leading role as paramount political principle for contemporary China, unquote. This mirrors a line that was actually in Xi's speech a couple of weeks ago, which is rather telling. Xi said, and I quote, the party, government, military, society, education, north, south, east, west. The party leads everything, unquote. Takeaway number 2. I said there's going to be a dark talk. I'm sorry. The anti-corruption campaign is here to stay. The anti-corruption campaign has been in place since Xi took over as General Secretary in November 2012 and will continue over the coming years. During his report to the Party Congress, Xi vowed that the fight against corruption would continue until there was a complete victory, and that corruption remains the biggest threat to the party, which means that the anti-corruption campaign will actually not only continue, it will likely accelerate. and will likely also focus on prevention and education. One major aspect of Xi's report to the Congress was, as we mentioned, was the integration of Xi Jinping thought. This is actually important in terms of party discipline, because Xi stressed party leadership in all work, bringing the party right back into the discourse through mobilization of ideology, cadres, and organization. He also stressed that only under the CPC's leadership can the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation and socialist modernization can be achieved. Xi's emphasis on party, sorry about that. We had to have the cute little graphic from CCTV, or now CGTN, I'm sorry. Xi's emphasis on the party's moral standing, by the way, is also important and necessary to maintain, and a necessity to maintain the party's trust. Anti-corruption campaigns, such as 3 stricts and 3 earnests, 2 studies, 1 action, and other rules and regulations have been formulated to rectify party historical nihilism. This book, by the way, is on rectifying historical nihilism, written by, surprise, surprise, Xi Jinping. Xi thus sees the anti-corruption campaign as his solemn task to save the party from itself and to ensure its legitimacy. However, there's also something else. Xi has used the anti-corruption campaign to not only go after the tigers and flies, but to eliminate key members of rival factions within the CPC. 2 factions in particular, the Shanghai faction, led by former President Jiang Zemin, and the Youth League faction, led by former President Hu Jintao. They're gone. They have been displaced. There is really now one faction, and the faction is the Xi Jinping faction. The anti-corruption campaign has reshaped the magnitude and composition of the ruling coalition and the size of the payoffs to remaining members, thereby strengthening Xi's own hold on power. Xi's speech, I should note also, his use of the anti-corruption campaign not only brought down actual and potential rivals, it helped him to consolidate power and expand power. This begs the question, and the question is, who's next? And will the anti-corruption campaign be used to extend Xi's power beyond 2022? Xi appointed a trusted loyalist, Zhao Lijie, to take over from Wang Qishan as chief of Central Commission on Discipline Inspection, Wang on the left, Zhao on the right. By appointing Zhao, Xi has effectively put every senior Chinese leader on notice. It suggests that the party's anti-corruption campaign is going to be rigorous. Why is it going to be rigorous? Because now they have announced, and it'll happen in March at the National People's Congress, the creation of a National Supervisory Commission, which will basically combine the efforts of both the CCDI and the Ministry of Supervision into basically a super anti-corruption agency. God help them all. It's going to be much like the TV series In the Name of the People, if you're familiar with that. It's a Chinese series on anti-corruption that was extraordinarily popular in China this last spring and summer. I'm guessing is that they're going to recruit people based on In the Name of the People, Renmin de Mingyi. Honestly, the creation of this new commission could actually be one of Xi's biggest developments during his second term. Something else to consider is that during the party congress, in a press conference that was with during the party, CCDI Deputy Secretary Yang Xiaodu stated that a large number of party cadres and members had been severely punished for corruption. They specifically named Zhou Yongkang, Ou Xilai, Sun Zhengkai, among others. Disclosed that a total of 440 cadres, 18 members or alternate members of the Central Committee, 9 members of the CCDI, 8,900 bureau-level cadres, 63,000 cadres at the county level, and something close to 1 million local-level cadres had been convicted or brought up on charges. Takeaway 3, a more muscular foreign policy. Before I discuss the impact of Politburo personnel appointments in terms of foreign policy, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the consolidation of Xi's power via appointments to the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee. These appointments broadly consolidated Xi's authority, and in fact gives him the ability not only to name a successor, but to influence Chinese politics for at least the next generation. While Xi retained 2 members of the rival youth league, Tuanpai, Li Keqiang as premier, Wang Yang as vice premier, Li was able to place 3 close allies onto the standing committee. Li Shanxu, Wang Hunin, who's really the one that's interesting, and Zhao Leji. He also was able to appoint Han Zhen, who was a former Shanghai party boss, who worked with Xi in Shanghai before Xi became vice president. He's less of a direct protege, but he's connected, which gives Xi a majority, a governing majority, solid one on the standing committee. Additionally, Xi moved many of his other closest proteges onto the Politburo, positioning him for the next round of promotions to the standing committee and perhaps even to the presidency and the general secretaryship itself. Li Qiang, one of Xi's closest advisors from Zhejiang province, is now the new party secretary in Shanghai. Li Shi, who's a close associate from Shanxi, was appointed party secretary of Guangdong. And of course, Chen Menir, who was connected to Xi through Zhejiang, took the Chongqing party secretary job right before the party congress. Xi also was able to have a clean sweep to control the appointments to the Central Military Commission. So let's return briefly to the impact on China's foreign policy. China, we already know, is becoming a major both major political and economic power, and has a profound impact on world politics. And Xi's made it quite clear, as Hans noted, that they're going to pursue a much more aggressive foreign policy, and basically presenting themselves, as I've mentioned, as an alternative role model for developing nations. Xi, in particular, talked about in his party speech about a new era, about taking a center stage in the world, about creating a strategic opportunity for China. This is Xi large and in charge, basically. He committed the party to reshaping the global order through major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics in the new era. As Hans mentioned earlier, this is quite notable because it ends Deng Xiaoping's axiom of keeping a low profile and hiding one's brightness. It articulates a much more ambitious and, we would think, aggressive plan for world influence. The promotion of State Councilor Yang Jieqi to the Politburo also signals a shift in Xi's view on global political and economic governance. Xi, I think, finally recognizes that foreign policy requires more attention and that Yang will take point on these issues in the Politburo. Yang's appointment makes him the most powerful foreign affairs official since Chiang Kai-shek, who was basically vice premier under Jiang Zemin. One interesting rumor is that Yang, in March at the National People's Congress, will become the first vice premier to be handed exclusive responsibilities for international issues, which would reflect a far greater attention paid to foreign affairs by Xi, who I think sees himself as attempting to supplant the U.S.'s influence as a prime international mover in the era of Donald Trump. Now, one primary way that Xi envisions China, please don't get barf-tastic on this because it's mentioned ad nauseum, ad infinitum, is of course Belt and Road, or as we call it in the West, Silk Road Initiative. The Silk Road Initiative, Belt and Road, is important. And why is it important? Because it's now been written into the Chinese Communist Party's constitution. It is now a formal component and a guiding concept in the party's foreign and national security affairs. And in fact, I should note, in the party document that announced Belt and Road being incorporated into the party constitution, it appeared in a paragraph devoted almost entirely to national security, which tells you something about the impact or the import of Belt and Road on Chinese strategy. It actually, in this respect, Belt and Road reasserts, in some respects, China's presence and power on the global stage. That's what Xi would tell you. You're going to find a lot more local governments, state-owned enterprises, investors are going to develop and build along the lines of Belt and Road. Something else to consider, and this might also make us in the West nervous, particularly in North America, is that now there's an initiative apparently to expand Belt and Road to a so-called North Polar Sea route initiative. Xi also made it clear that he was going to use foreign investment as an external force to help drive the domestic agenda. And in fact, he promised to lower barriers for investors for foreign direct investment. He pledged to basically make the doors wide open for foreign investment. All right. Final remarks, I promise, so we can get to Q&As. This is what happens when you're the guy batting cleanup. Got to hurry up. The politics of the 19th Party Congress may have been rather opaque, but the policy direction, I think, was much clearer. Xi Jinping saw his leadership of the Communist Party consolidated for at least the next 5 years, if not longer. He also saw his status elevated by the party through his theory on Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics, as well as embarking on a journey to create a great modern socialist nation by 2049. 2049 is important, the centennial anniversary of the founding of New China. Xi's speech to the Party Congress put forward an ambitious vision for China's growth that extends through the first half of the 21st century. He projected a China that is increasingly confident on the world stage, that is, in fact, looking at transforming into an advanced economy and ready to address all sorts of social issues. The 19th Party Congress also heralded China's willingness to play a bigger role in shaping the world's future agenda, whether we like it or not, and to offer something essentially we might call the China solution to problems. These developments will, as Hans noted in terms of foreign policy, will bring profound impacts not just on China's economic and social development, but on the world. And China's rising influence in the world in particular will have an impact on our relations. During the past 5 years, Xi could be viewed as a successful general secretary of the party. He took down all sorts of corrupt officials. Yeah, he basically eliminated all of his enemies. Let's be honest. He basically strengthened his own power. To accomplish the goals that he set forth in his Party Congress speech, and as Hans mentioned, it was a marathon speech if you watched it. It was 3 hours and 25 minutes. It was amazing, the length of time to watch the thing. If he's going to do this, he's going to have to double down on what he did during his first term as General Secretary, and that is, of course, to reassert the importance of the party's guidance on the economy and all other facets of society. And after laying out his vision for China's immediate and long-term future, it's now up to him to actually accomplish this. The real question is, will he accomplish it in 5 years, or will it take longer? Thank y'all.
If I could ask our panelists to sit in our chairs and we can answer some questions. So we'll have about 20 minutes or so of questions, and then we can adjourn outside for some snacks and one-on-one conversations with our experts. So who would like to start us off? First question. You in the back with the blue shirt.
Yeah, for the last couple of decades, we've been hearing about the insertion of the Han culture into Xinjiang and Gansu and Western China. And, once petroleum was discovered in Kalamu, we heard a lot about it then, and a lot more. Recently, much less. Is the program complete or not? And 25 years ago, when things were beginning to open up commercially, at least among the petroleum folks that I ran into, about 10%, maybe a little more, of the professionals and low-level managers were women. Now, it's 25 years on, since commerce has been the big news in China for so long because the politics hasn't changed. Are women now in the upper management ranks of the commercial area?
I'll address the women's issue. So yes and no. So that there generally tends to be, again, sort of an informal quota element. So a lot of what we consider to be tokenism, right? So there are women that make it into certain positions, but ultimately don't have the kind of authority or power that you would expect. And that's common. Again, China's not unique in that particular sense. And so you do find different, it's more about how women have moved into different types of roles. And so you'll still find women in, let's say, in heavy industry, but not very many. You'll find women more often in light industries, more often in the service sector. And so when you look at, actual power positions, they're just not there.
And I'll just add to a little bit about the first part of your question about energy. China is still exploring for onshore, sources of oil, but they switched more to offshore, even for oil, and most of what they're doing is related to gas at this point, and especially since a lot of the foreign partners are no longer interested in oil. There is some potential for shale oil in China. So there's still some projects going on with shale oil in China, but most of it's dealing with pipeline gas from Central Asia or more increasingly from Russia, and then a lot of LNG projects. And now that nuclear power is coming back online very, very slowly in Japan, you're very likely to see less demand. Potentially for natural gas from other parts of the world, even though we are exporting to China currently. So that's kind of like the bigger energy picture. Maybe here in the front.
How does China, being a one-party dictatorship, how does their control over a corporation like Alibaba differ from the way our government treats our big corporations? Do they own part of Alibaba? How do they control it?
Okay. So if you look at the development of the IT industry, in particular internet, social media, and now cloud computing, big data, you can see that many companies develop outside of direct government investment or control. And your question, how then the government actually exert a power on those companies is very complicated. First, there are a lot of government regulations and license. And without those licenses, none of those digital companies can operate. So that's one layer of control. And another layer is the government still have a lot of power in terms of foreign investment. For instance, if some of the companies want to develop their business overseas, they often have to get approval from the government. One example, I think, is recently the case of Wanda. Wanda was very aggressive last year in purchasing some of Hollywood properties. But I think now it's kind of vanished from headline news because China just had a new tighten up financial regulations to constrain the outflow of capital from China. And the latest idea, as I mentioned in the talk, so the government now considering to impose 1% government management stake in some of the largest tech companies. And it's still ongoing, and how this is going to be eventually actualized is still open. But I think it is quite difficult for many of these tech companies to totally reject these proposals from the government.
There's also another angle, and that is, of course, many large corporations in China also have a party committee, which is placed within the businesses. So the result is you have actually government control and you have party control. You have a work group, a Danwei, that also plays a role too. And so the control is not quite like the United States, but yeah, there is control in a variety and subtle ways.
I think way in the back there.
If I might ask two quick questions. One is, Dr. Taylor, let me mention the new Chinese base in Djibouti. The question is, you're into an area that already has Russia, now Saudi Arabia, the U.S., Iran. How does China look to play a role, or are they just a tepid player right now entering the Middle East? Second, please, somebody tell me where China will go with North Korea.
All right, so I got to do Djibouti. Well, the Chinese would tell you it's only a service station. It's a small presence. It's to guarantee and to protect Chinese interest along the maritime Silk Road. The reality is that China's a major world power. They're going to do what the United States, what Russia, what other powers have done, and that's, of course, to do force projection. This is about force projection, long-term force projection. At least that's how I'd answer it. You might agree or disagree on that one.
There's discussion about Pakistan and Afghanistan also soon hosting service stations.
Yep. Yeah, service, particularly Pakistan. The other part was on
North Korea.
North Korea? I ain't answering that one. Let somebody over here.
We can't even tell you what was going to happen in this 19th Party Congress, right? Those of us who study Chinese politics and make a career out of it, we're still speculating, days before. Are there going to be 5 members? Are there going to be 7 members? Is he going to stay on? Is he going to appoint a successor? We can't even predict that. So to know what they're going to do with North Korea would be an impossible feat.
Although I will note that Kim Jong-un did not fire off any missiles during the Party Congress, which may say something.
Yeah, one thing I can say is that China is, at the very least, as concerned as the U.S. because that's a very real threat to China's security too.
And just related to that, I think part of it is also, I think, just the potential for refugees, millions of refugees. And people in the West blithely talk about, well, maybe the Koreas can reunite just like Germany did. But East Germany is much, much smaller than West Germany, whereas North Korea has about the same population and much greater poverty. The other thing I thought found very interesting is we know earlier this year, was the end of last year, Kim Jong-un had his brother assassinated. But the Chinese government just announced recently, if I remember, that the brother's son is now under Chinese protection in China, and there was some type of assassination attempt on his life, which raises a possibility that Beijing has the potential to smuggle an heir successor into North Korea if there's some opportunity to do so. So that would be quite interesting as a possibility.
Dandong's a nice large city, too, to smuggle in, so
Yeah.
along the North Korean border.
Maybe over here?
Yes, in the past, there's been this policy of the U.S. not letting its partners export technology to China, and in return, that has created a very big supercomputer industry in China, as example being the Sunway Taihu Light. Do you think this 1% control of the Chinese government is going to impede a certain export of their technology to the West, or it could actually promote it?
I think that's a very interesting question. If we discuss this internationalization or globalization of Chinese tech companies, you can see that although many of them kind of operating outside of China, in the US and in Europe, but in particular in Southeast Asia, but by and large, their globalization effort hasn't been paying off very nicely by this far. For instance, Weibo, WeChat, they are, of course, boasting, closing to 1 billion users. But if you look at who are their users, primarily Chinese. And they do have some users outside of China, but then again, if you look closer, overseas Chinese. And these data and the privacy issues further aid such concerns.
Okay. Gentleman over here? You, yeah.
I have a question about the economy. What do you think will this new power distribution in Central Committee and Xi's emphasis on party's leadership on all aspects will affect Chinese economy in the future?
Maybe you want to take that one?
I guess I'll take it. Having Wang Yang in charge as vice premier, I think his portfolio is going to be nothing but economic issues and economic development. The emphasis by Li Keqiang on income inequality, tying all this to urbanization and townization, moving 300 million people out of the countryside, all tie that to Belt and Road and the idea of linking that to development issues, big data issue, and particularly in Guiyang, to name but a few. It's all tied together. If you look at the number of people that were put on the Politburo, the 25 members of the Politburo, majority are basically economic portfolio people.
Also just emphasize on other things like transportation, right? Every city over 1 million people is connected by high-speed rail.
Yep.
And the Chinese government's also announced it would like to move away from petroleum cars to electric cars, which would increase the need for more nuclear power or renewables or natural gas, most likely natural gas to actually fuel that. And so the Chinese Communist Party firmly believes in climate change and is working to do something about it.
And again, it's written in the party constitution now for environmental protection.
Right. That's right. Maybe right here? Yeah.
Big picture question on who's number one and for how long in terms of U.S. and China. Looking at their whole system and the efficiencies of having the Communist Party rule versus us squabbling with two parties. And the way our country's going to the way they are, the fact they have 5 times as many people, and so on, people are having more material products than they had before, and so on. Are there any weaknesses in the Chinese system or Communist Party system that would slow them down or stop them or cause things to collapse such that they don't inexorably overtake the U.S. economically, politically, militarily?
Sounds like you're a little more pessimistic than maybe some of the other people asking questions.
If I could
take that?
Yeah, take just a stab at the first part of that question, and that is, China and the United States are not playing the same game when it comes to empire building. I think, to crib from the Malian dialogue in the Peloponnesian Chronicles, the traditional Western view is we view power as the ability to compel. But I think during the European period, it became the power to occupy, right? You demonstrated your might by your ability to occupy physical space throughout the world. I think what the Chinese are looking for, at least in the next 10 years, is simply the power to compel. They don't want the physical, infrastructural, costly military infrastructure all over the world. They don't necessarily need a 7th fleet, their 7th fleet in our Atlantic. But they want to use their economic might, their soft power, their strategic, their everything, all 5 dimensions, to influence state behaviors. More of a vassal kind of way, if you're a student of Chinese history. So direct occupation, right? So the whole notion of power and number one is very different for the Chinese. Europeans are flag planters. The Chinese have been a little more relaxed about that in the past.
If there's an analogy to use, it's chess versus Go. And the game of Go is a much different game in terms of how you engage in strategy versus control. The Chinese approach is Go. Simply put, it is not a case of trying to take over territory. It's not a case of trying to do empire building. There's also something else to keep in mind. Those of us that go to China, the only way you can operate is to have a virtual private network on your cell phone or on your computer and such. Information technology being what it is, and the dissemination of information is going to be one of the Achilles heels, in my opinion, of China's ability to basically project itself into the future. Economically, yes, there's a pledge by the party to lift everybody out of poverty by 2020 or 2021 by the next 5-year plan. We're still talking right now of a 1.4 billion population. Officially, the Chinese government would say there's less than 100 million still in abject poverty. In real terms, there's probably a good 700 million still in what we would define as poverty. So China may be much larger than the United States. It may, in fact, surpass us in terms of real GDP, but it's still 3 to 4 times poorer than the United States per capita. There's your optimistic part.
And just as a political scientist, I also want to add in that we're entering kind of a new world where you have, first, a Chinese leader with this much power, but in the modern economy era, including with capital markets, right? So every leader gets sick sooner or later, right? And what happens? Well, under the old planned economy, they would just cover it up for a while, and the committees just keep doing what they're supposed to be doing. But stock markets have a way of figuring out if the one person running every single thing and who's chairman of everything is actually sick. Now, how will they respond? And also, how will we respond, since our stock markets are increasingly linked to their stock markets? So I think we have time for maybe one more question. In the back, this you with the black. Yes.
Yeah, kind of going with this gentleman's question, what do you think, you're saying that their hegemonic powers are different, but nonetheless China is a hegemonic, it's a multipolar world that we're living in today. What's the longevity of that multipolarity?
I think it's always, it's always tough to think about, because I think one of the things that we're looking at is sort of a loss of hegemony from the United States. So we're looking at it as a zero-sum game, right? So any gain that China has is in some way is considered a loss for the U.S. And I think that's kind of the wrong way to look at it, because they have different goals, as Hans was mentioning before, very different goals in their outlook. If you want to look at comparing one by one, militarily, China's not superior to the United States in terms of technology or anything else. But what they are better at is they have a better PR campaign in terms of of not being seen in the same kind of way that the U.S. is. You know, when you talk about the U.S. overseas, people start getting a bad taste in their mouth. The Chinese don't quite have that yet. They are moving that way with some of their allies. You know, when you look at the investments they've had in Africa, originally were seen as being quite good, and now they're looking at being more exploitive. And so China's looking for other ways that it can try to build that sort of social capital. So the Chinese are a little bit better than the U.S. in terms of not coming with the same political baggage that the U.S. does. And so in that sense, they win in the diplomatic or sort of friends-building PR kind of elements. But it really is, like Han said before, it's a very different game and a different approach. I think we have to move in some ways away from that.
Oh, please.
Okay, I really like the metaphor of chess and Go, but both chess and Go have been beaten by AI.
Good point. Really good point.
So I really appreciate the comments here. I think now we are playing a very different game. Either US or China are going to become the number one, and I think at the very minimum, the two countries cannot afford to be enemies.
And I mean, one more, okay.
Steve, if I could.
Oh, did you want to say? Go ahead.
So just to go into that dangerous area of giving you predictions and that kind of thing, just if I take one anecdote, and that is Chinese tourists outside of China, overseas, just by nature, by discretionary income, they remind me of the American tourists of the 1950s. All right, and they are increasingly becoming the ugly tourists that we used to be in the 1950s. So if you look at the 50s as a trajectory, and your ability to send tourists overseas is an incredible measure of your might, your power. We're not done yet, and it's been 70 years later, right? So if you look at the rise in the, I'm doing that wrong. Wow, I need to take a nap. Anyway, if you look at the rise and decline, then China rising, it could be as early as the 1950s for them.
I might note, we've got 4 political scientists on this panel. We're the same.
Don't blame her.
I know, I said 4 political scientists, counting Steve.
I'm a sociologist.
We're the same discipline that failed to predict Donald Trump and failed, and all said in mid-1989 that the Berlin Wall was never going to fall. So take everything we say with a grain of salt.
That's true.
What?
They're going to want the money back.
I know. Yeah.
So on that realistic note, we can offer definitely something tastier, more enticing, just outside. So please thank all of our panelists, and thank you all for coming. And please join us outside.